Almost 35 years in journalism, almost 25 years of publishing right here in Horry County. Who is he? You'll meet him coming up next on Carolina People. Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're at the Fox 43 studio. We're focused on community newspapers, and we're visiting with the founder and publisher of the Horry Independent, the Laura Scene, the News and Shopper, Steve Robertson. Good morning, Steve.
Well, good morning, Greg. Nice to be with you.
Thanks so much for coming in. It's amazing rattling off 3 separate publications. That's a pretty big deal.
Well, I guess it's somewhat of a big deal. It doesn't seem like it sometimes, though.
When you travel all around, and of course one of the great things about the Horry Independent, I think is it the largest community paper in South Carolina now?
Well, we believe it is. We've been in business now for close to 25 years, and we've been very fortunate to see our circulation just grow very rapidly and sustain itself over those years.
Steve, I think I saw in doing a little research the incredible figure. Was it the end of the first month or the end of the first couple of months that y'all were already at 2,000 in circulation back in 1980?
Well, you have a great memory. That's true. It did just take right off, and within just a few weeks of giving out sample papers, the subscriptions started rolling in rapidly.
Right. I think I saw at the end of 2 years maybe y'all were at 5,000.
Right.
Which was an incredible figure to think about that. That's twice the size of the Myrtle Beach Herald. I mean, another paper that's been around a decade, and to think about that explosive growth. What is it about community newspapers that gets folks excited, Steve?
Well, I think people like to read about their friends and their neighbors, Greg.
Mm-hmm.
National news, international news is very important, of course, and you can find it on your station, and you can read the local daily paper here for that kind of news. But if you want to find out what your friend next door is doing, or what's happening in the church down the street, or what's happening in the school around the corner, oftentimes your best bet is to look for it in a community newspaper like the Horry Independent.
And there are a heck of a lot of community newspapers. We think about in our viewing area, old ones like the Dillon Herald, the Marlboro Herald Advocate, the Darlington paper, obviously the Hartsville Messenger. Of course, your own paper that got started back in 1980, Polly Lohman's publication, the North Myrtle Beach Times, in 1971, I think.
Right.
And so many others, the Coastal Observer, obviously the Herald, the Myrtle Beach Herald, such a newbie to the scene, the Laura Scene, which has been around a good while, and talking to Ricky Hardy a while back about y'all's, you and your wife having purchased his publication, I believe, in 1999.
That's correct.
Said that transition's been very positive. It looks like y'all will continue to expand in the Loris area.
Well, Loris is a great little community.
Yeah.
It's just a few miles from the beach. It's on Highway 9. Has Loris Community Hospital there. That's just a tremendous employer in that area. I really feel like Loris is a great community with a lot of potential, and we've seen that potential starting to develop since we purchased the paper a few years back.
And of course, that community served by 3 community newspapers. You think about the Tabor City publication that comes in, of course the Loris Times, which was started in the late 90s, or early 90s, I think maybe 1991 up there, coming out of North Myrtle Beach, one of Polly's publications, and then of course the one that you purchased in 99. 3 for a community as small as Loris. It's amazing.
Well, it is. I do not know of any other town the size of Loris that has 3 newspapers, and all 3 seem to be doing very well.
Yeah, it is incredible. I was dating a woman in Loris for about 3 months and would travel over there on a regular basis, and we'd walk down Main Street there, and you'd see boxes for I guess, of course, the Laura Scene's right there on Main Street. Incredible locations, but you'd see a box of the Loris Times. You'd walk into a little store there, and there'd be the Tabor City paper, and I thought, how is this happening? I mean, is it just the John Chenrett, Bob Brooks explosion? This is an entrepreneurial town? Or what is it? I couldn't figure it out.
It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Typically, a town the size of Loris would have 1 paper.
Right. If that.
And it might be fortunate to have 1 paper because many communities the size of Loris do not have their own paper. And like you say, Greg, to have 3 is truly amazing.
It is. It is. I'm glad you're a part of that, Steve. Real quick, for viewers who may not have met you over there on Main Street in Conway, or as you travel around the area, or your time as president of the South Carolina Press Association. Are you originally from the area?
No, I grew up Air Force brat.
Ooh, wow.
And so I traveled with my family throughout the United States. We spent 3 years on duty in Japan.
Really?
And that was our only overseas assignment. But I tried to compute at one time. I think we've stayed at more than 25 different bases.
Oh, come on.
As a young person, right.
Wow. Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have 2 brothers.
3 boys?
Yeah.
Now, are your folks, are they still living?
No, my father passed recently, but my mother is living in Marion County.
Oh, great.
She's a retired school teacher.
Is that right? His last assignment was where, Steve?
It was in Plattsburgh, New York.
Okay.
One of the coldest places I think we ever lived.
Yeah, it must have been. It must have been. Now, was he ever stationed at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base?
Ironically, he was never stationed here. And as it turns out, he retired here.
That's amazing. Well, of course, you know right now we're in the former Air Flight Simulator. The Air Flight Simulator was housed here in this building, now the Fox 43 studio. The old, even more former Air Flight Simulator is next door, which is now Divine Dining's corporate headquarters. So some of these buildings out on the former Air Force Base have been turned into some good things, into some good uses. And, of course, the Air Force did so much for the area.
Well, they were a real impact. When I first came to Horry County in the early 1970s, they were still, going real strong. I think they were flying the Warthogs, the A-10s back then.
That's right.
And it was a very common sight to see those planes training in the area. I hated to see the Air Force go, but I had an opportunity to ride through the air base development, and I came over to see you folks, and I'm pretty impressed with what's taking place here on the old campus.
Oh yeah, they've done a lot. They've done a lot. What was that like traveling around from community to community, growing up, Steve? For you, as either as a youngster or as a teenager, recognizing, I think you said 8 high schools. I hate to put that out because it sounds so amazing, but 8 high schools for yourself.
Yeah. Well, you certainly cannot have time to put roots down, but at the same time, it's a very exciting lifestyle and one that I enjoyed tremendously. I did go to 8 high schools, finished up in Melbourne, Florida, and that's where I first got the ink in my blood.
Yeah.
It's still there. But, it's a different lifestyle. It's not for everybody. Interestingly, when my father did retire, and I found a home in Conway, I stayed.
Yes,
and I
that's
have
right.
no plans to leave.
I was about to ask, because it looks like you've been in Conway a heck of a long time with the 5 years at the Field and Herald prior to setting up the Horry Independent there. You've been there almost 30 years now.
Right. Conway is my home. I absolutely love it. I love the people. I love the atmosphere of a small town. I truly found home when I found my way to Conway, South Carolina.
Yeah, yeah. And you call it a small town, and it is such a bustling area. And to think about it being the county seat for geographically the largest county in the state, one of the largest population counties in the state of South Carolina, obviously in the Carolinas, but geographically such a huge county. And to have Conway as the center point, I mean, everything really flows through Conway, or has to.
Well, if you look at a map, all the roads converge in Conway.
Right.
And I think it's very fortunate that Conway is the county seat, because it's kept our community very vibrant. If you travel to Conway, you'll notice that our main street is unlike most main streets nowadays. There's still people in the businesses. There's a lot of life in our downtown area. And then travel about, and you'll see the various buildings that where county business is conducted.
Oh, yeah.
And that plays a tremendous part of our economic backbone in Conway, too.
And that new judicial center over there, Steve, that must have been exciting to watch that as it expanded, as the construction of that began and concluded, and to see how much goes through that building. Now in the old courthouse across the street, I mean, just a heck of a lot happening.
Well, it is, and it's such a dramatic change from when I first started covering county government back in 1973 for the daily paper at Myrtle Beach. I remember back then, all of the county's business was conducted in about maybe a 2,500 square foot area. When I met with the county council, I was the only reporter there. There was no television, no radio. And they would all just sit very informally around a table, and that was it. Now it's become quite big business, and it's televised, and the whole 9 yards.
Were they comfortable having you around then, Steve, in '73? If you were the only one, I mean, were they used to it, or?
No, they weren't. Prior to the Myrtle Beach Sun-News becoming a daily paper, I think that coverage of county government was somewhat spotty.
Right.
Also, prior to the 1970s, it was difficult to cover county government because any government body could go into a secret session, close their door for practically any reason they wanted to. So if a reporter showed up on their doorsteps wanting to cover the meeting, they could shut the door quite easily with no justification whatsoever.
None whatsoever?
None whatsoever.
Now, and that must have changed then in the 70s.
It did. The South Carolina Freedom of Information Act actually got its start around 1970 when Dick Riley, who later became governor of South Carolina, and Gene Toll, who later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, spearheaded a movement to bring sunshine into South Carolina government. And with the backing of the South Carolina Press Association and many other people who are interested in open government, the South Carolina General Assembly did pass a Freedom of Information Act, and it was that act that allowed reporters like me to have much more ready access to governmental meetings.
So, Steve, the Freedom of Information Acts are passed state to state. That's not federal.
There is a federal Freedom of Information Act, but it really did not apply to state government, only to federal agencies.
Okay. So the access that you may have had to federal agencies throughout South Carolina was one thing, but it was very limited as it related to state.
Well, exactly. And most federal jobs or federal agencies really are not of interest to us. We're more interested in the county council and the school board and the city council meetings.
And all that you were barred from attending until those sunshine things.
Well, we could go, and often we did, but if there was ever anything of a sensitive matter to be discussed, they just booted us right out.
That's amazing, Steve. That is amazing. You talked about getting the ink under the fingernails or getting that in your blood back in 1970. You think that's almost 35 years ago. And not to date you there, I'm sorry to put that on you, but to get that out, obviously the excitement down in Melbourne, Florida, I think I saw, and then when you were at Francis Marion for a couple of years involved in Florence Morning News, was that a daily then?
Florence has been a daily for about 100 years, so it was an established daily newspaper when I went to work for them.
Right.
Actually, I took that job to work my way through college at Francis Marion, and as it turned out, I really developed a strong interest in journalism, and that's what kind of got me into this whole career field.
Steve, the excitement, you think about that aspect of being in Florence, you said it's been a daily newspaper for more than 100 years or around 100 years. That aspect must have been a great place to get the beginnings of your journalism career.
Well, it was almost like a learning lab for us, and for me in particular. And there's a lot of young people that went through the Florence Morning News in the 70s, and we're still good friends. But in the 70s, the Florence Morning News was just starting to go through the transition from what we call hot type to cold type. They actually used hot lead to set the typefaces, and it went to the press on big lead sheets and was printed. So it was a great time to be coming through the newspaper business because, as you know now, everything's done electronically. So I was able to see this huge leap from lead type to the electronic age.
And that was happening literally in the 70s.
It started in the 70s, and of course, got its wings with the first Macintosh computers in the 1980s, and now, if we couldn't do it electronically, I don't know how we would do it.
Yeah, it'd be a heck of a chore. That's right.
It certainly would.
It'd be a heck of a chore. Well, it's been so exciting to see, of course, y'all's expansion. I think I saw y'all moved into an amazing new facility in the early 90s, and then even buying your own presses and being able to expand to do a heck of a lot more, setting up a commercial printing division. I think I saw in 2001. A heck of a lot's happening in your own operation there in Conway now.
Well, the paper continues to grow. When we acquired the Laura Scene in 1999 and then started expanding the circulation of the News and Shopper, it became feasible to look into purchasing a press and doing the printing ourselves. And in 2001, we had an opportunity come forward that we took advantage of, and it's worked real well for us. We certainly have a lot more flexibility as to when we can run and how much we run and how much color we put into the paper. It's been a good economic decision for us.
That must be exciting. Of course, one of the great things, the Robertson comes out on Wednesdays, the Oriole Independent on Thursdays, and of course, when does the News and Shopper come out?
We print the Shopper on Monday, and it's delivered on Tuesday.
Right.
So we have those back-to-back publishing dates. Certainly can be somewhat hairy at times with those many deadlines coming one right after the other, but that's part of the business, and you learn to adjust to it.
What was that like, Steve, in the first place? You think back to 1980, I think it was, and of course not to jump far too quickly, and I want to get back to some of those early days there at the Sun News, and then moving into the Field and Herald, being there in Conway, recognizing that was the place you would not only stay and raise your children and raise your publication. But of course, you think about that in 1980, when you all actually made a decision. It was you and I think I read 4 other businessmen there in the area?
Right, 4 good friends of mine. We had Kenneth Holt, who was the mayor of Conway at the time. We had Audrey Hardwick, Norman Moore, and Delano Sanders. 4 very prominent business people, and we just hit it off, and we all shared the same sentiment that Conway needed a locally owned newspaper. At the time, the existing weekly paper there was owned by a chain newspaper, and we just felt like it had lost some of its sense of community.
Well, you know, I'd interviewed a gentleman who'd been a publisher or editor of a publication there in Conway, Bill Darby, who you and I both know. I think it was the Oriole Herald.
Right.
Or the Oriole Herald, maybe. That was owned by a guy in Marion. And he had brought Bill in as a salesman or sales manager, and then he became publisher, and before he launched Coast, and now later Coast and Alternatives. But to hear him talk about that, being there in Conway and the excitement of Conway, this is in the early 50s, mid-50s, maybe 55 time. Steve, even a good 25 years or 35 years before you all were even launching off to do your own thing.
Sure. Talking to some of the old-timers, and I'm not calling Bill an old-timer, but he's been here a little bit longer than I have. I think the 50s and 60s were just dynamic times for the city of Conway. You know, at that time, Myrtle Beach was almost an afterthought. It had this very small tourism season, and then it pretty much shut the doors for the rest of the year. And so, yes, Conway was the center of the county. The farmers would come into town after the harvest. And I talked with the chief of police there who served for many years, Chief Barker. And he told me about the days when many of the streets were dirt. And it was almost like a Wild West town, he told me.
Yeah.
But that was a little bit before my time.
Right. But now, so, of course, when you arrived at the Sun News, came down from the Florence Morning News, did you move down here to attend school as well? I think I saw you later were graduated from Coastal Carolina.
Well, I decided to put my studies at Francis Marion on hold in order to become the sports editor of the Sun News in 1973. As you probably know, that's the year that Mark Garner sold the paper to the State Record Company, and turned it into a nice little daily newspaper. They were looking for a sports editor, and I jumped at the opportunity and came on down at that time.
Wow, so it became a daily in 1973. The Sun News has only been a daily for a little more than 30 years.
Yeah, it's a relatively young daily newspaper, but it's come a long way in those few years.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I saw in 86 maybe when Knight Ridder stepped in and bought the State Record that they were at a good 50-some thousand circulation. So I suspect in that, you know, in that 13 years or so, they grew that fast.
Well, again, some very smart people saw a window of opportunity, and it's paid off, I think, very handsomely for them.
Yeah, for Knight Ridder, they've done just fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. I'm sure they've just done just fine. Jerry Osmond was with us a couple of, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. Steve, the former editor of the Sun News, who was there for a heck of a long time, hearing him talk about the machinations within a daily paper, he having trained at one time in the upstate at a community newspaper, but to hear him talk about what all goes on with those daily deadlines, talking to someone else yesterday and preparing for your interview today, he was saying, ask Steve what it's like, you know, some of the difference between a daily and a community newspaper, some of the benefits of being a community newspaper and some of the benefits of being a daily. When you think about it, having worked in both, how do you perceive those differences and some of the pluses and on both sides?
Well, there's some similarities and some big differences. The big difference, I think, would be the deadlines. Of course, the dailies have that everyday deadline when they have to get to press.
Yeah.
And as a result, sometimes they're not able to spend quite as much time as a weekly might have developing a story. For example, county council. Their reporter would have to cover the county council meeting and be back at a certain time in order to meet their deadline. We have the luxury of having an extra day or two to do follow-ups, to contact other sources, to maybe develop storylines a little bit longer. But I think the really big difference, Greg, is our missions and our little niches in our communities. The daily newspaper has a much broader mission than the community newspaper, in that they have to report the international news, the national news, and the state news, as well as trying to report that local news too. Well, in our situation, local news is our niche. That's what we're all about. We're about covering government and other important issues to our readers. But our meat and potato, our bread and butter, so to speak, is what's happening in our community with folks that read our newspaper. And that's why you'll probably see us devote more time to weddings, engagements, church news, lots of school news. And when somebody does something good, we like to put it in the paper. I think that would probably be the biggest difference between the two. Now, something else I think every newspaper shares, at least I would like to think so, Greg, is absolute commitment to presenting the news fairly, truthfully, and impartially. And that ranks, that's very important in our operation.
Being unbiased, absolutely. I think we saw community newspapers start in the very recent past, maybe down in Hanahan or somewhere. A woman, I think she was the recipient of the Freedom of Information Act award last year at the South Carolina Press Association, or maybe the year before. The amazing person, or maybe it was Hardyville, somewhere else, someone who had a commitment to getting out there, feeling that some folks were just acting dishonestly behind closed doors, and this person really wanted to make a difference in an unbiased, as you say, in a very impartial situation, but just wanting to get the sunshine into those closed board meetings. And I'm sure that must be a big effort on your part.
Well, it certainly is. That's the first thing we try to train our reporters about, is being truthful and being unbiased, impartial, and being very objective. There's a place in newspapers for opinion, but that's on the editorial page, and that's where we try to keep it.
We got about 3 minutes, and of course, Steve, I hope you'll be willing to come back and share with us some more things tomorrow. Obviously, we want to talk about that exciting award that you all received in 1993. I think the Reed, I can't remember the name of it, a big award for the Freedom of Information Act. I want to highlight that. One thing Jerry talked a little bit about, Steve, was that aspect of the difference between a publisher and editor. The publisher actually oversees both sides, not only the sales side, but also the news side. The editor exclusively dedicated to news, and some of the difficulties that are oftentimes apparent when a news reporter has to cover an article that would potentially negatively impact a large advertiser. And how you handle that with kid gloves. How do you go about, not that that's ever happened in almost 25 years, I'm sure that's faced you, but what do you do in a situation like that?
Well, the first part of your question that's addressed first would be publisher versus editor. And there certainly is a difference. The editor at our paper is Kathy Ropp, and she is in charge of all of the news gathering part of our organization. That would include, editing copy, laying out the paper, giving assignments to reporters and that type of thing. A publisher has to wear a few more hats than that. We have to make sure that the advertising is rolling in and giving us a firm, sound financial base, that our circulation numbers are continuing to grow, and that we're distributing the paper in a timely fashion. Now, the other part of your question, it's a very interesting question, by the way, but it happens not frequently, but on occasion, where we have a large customer that would prefer that we don't do a story. What we have to do is ask ourselves this question: is the story true? Okay, if it passes that test, is it something that we can corroborate? And then we have to start weighing a lot of factors into it, but the biggest one is it sufficient public interest that it overrides the concerns of the advertiser. And it's a delicate little balancing act, but in the end, our readers always come before our advertisers, as important as our advertisers are.
Those are great words. Steve, thanks so much for being with us. Are you willing to come back tomorrow and spend a little time with us?
Well, I'd love to. I'm enjoying myself.
Great. We got a lot more to talk about.
Okay.
Okay. Stay tuned to more Carolina People with Steve Robertson coming up next. If you've been with us the last 30 minutes, you'd see Steve Robertson and their commitment to a free press here with the Orion Independent in Conway. You would have learned a little bit about Conway and a lot more about the expansive growth of Conway. If you come back and visit with us tomorrow morning, you'll learn about why there's only one award on the wall in the offices of the Orion Independent right there on Main Street in Conway. Stay tuned. It'll be a big day tomorrow.